Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of One Single Story. Today I'm joined by Pastor Chris Rexroad and Pastor Sheryl Daughety. This year we're examining the themes of each book of the Bible, and today we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel. So the theme of 2 Samuel is unification and restoration. So the country coming back together as one country, being united around David. Around David as king. And then this restoration period that takes place. And this thing happens multiple times in this book. So chapters 1 through 5, David becomes king. Chapters 5 and 6, David becomes king of all of Israel. Chapter 7, which we're going to look at today, the Lord makes this covenant promise with David about the kingship forever. And chapter 9, David sends for Jonathan's son to restore him to his rightful place as a piece of the throne or to have royal privileges. Chapter 11 and 12, David sins with Bathsheba and is reconciled to God. In chapter 14, David and Absalom reconcile. So they had been separated because of one of David's other sons raped one of his daughters. It became a rift. They got reconciled. Then 15 tells us about Absalom rebelling, and then David leaves. And then 19 and 20, David returns to Jerusalem as king. So we're going to talk about 7 today, but of those other pieces of restoration, unification, other pieces of David's story, because this kind of goes a big piece of David's history. Is there one of those pieces that stick out to you more than the other, that you think of more than the other? Maybe you've heard taught on more than another.
I've not heard it taught on that I can think of, but I do think that all of the issues that kind of divide David and his son Absalom are really interesting and sad, but also I think what's interesting about the restoration piece of that story is that they do become united again. So in that way, I think David did what he could do to restore the relationship, but then, Absalom decides he needs to be king, basically. And I think that it's like an important story for us to say, you can only do what you can do. You can't control how the other person's going to handle that.
Right.
But that restoration doesn't necessarily always have a happy ending.
Mm-hmm. And in that case, and I have a theory about David that we've talked about before in other podcasts, but in that particular case, it appears to me that David had the right motives. He genuinely missed his son. But it does not appear Absalom had the right motives any of the time. Like from the very beginning, he's angling because it seems to me that he's lost so much respect for his father that he just can't bear to see him in charge anymore. And he's like, if I was king, I think we've all said those things. If I was in charge, we'd do something different. And maybe it would be better, maybe it would be worse. I mean, we don't know. It'd just be different. So I would say, and I think that's the difficult piece of restoration, and I don't know that it's in anything we're going to talk about today, but so we can talk about it now, is restoration is only effective when both people's hearts are in the right place. Yeah. Chris, you have any insight on that story or another piece of this?
I just think it just kind of stands out to me that the amount of time it took, and I guess I put myself in the position of the person there, what they felt, what they were going through, but from the time that David was selected as king to the point where he was anointed as king, and when he actually took over and everything that took place in there leading up to what we're about ready to talk about today, what a roller coaster ride, with God and staying faithful to what he's calling you to.
Yeah, in David's case, I think the story about Bathsheba sticks out for people. That becomes a marker. Obviously, him killing Goliath is an early marker. But I think, and those are times when he took a wrong action or a right action. That's the interesting thing that I find about David, is that when he took action, whether it was right or wrong, it seemed to work out okay. So even at the end of the book, 2 Samuel, he's going to take a census, and then God's going to say, "Hey, you did this wrong," and he repents, and it turns, But he took action. It is the times that he doesn't take action that I think cost him the most. Um, I think the last podcast, somehow we got to talking about Saul. He should have killed Saul. Like, I firmly believe he should have killed him. I don't waver on it. Like, God had departed from him. He was done. He should have killed him. Just been done with. He should have killed Amnon. He should have killed his son Amnon. Like, he should have just taken him out because he raped his daughter. Like, somebody was going to do it. Anybody else would have gotten that punishment. I mean, had another person in the palace committed that crime, they would have died immediately. When Absalom comes against him, instead of being decisive, he flees. He runs from the decision. And it seems like when he takes action, right or wrong, and I think this is kind of the way I approach life, and I think statistics kind of bear it out. You're better off to make a wrong decision and correct it and make a right decision than you are to make no decision at all. No decision at all often eases your conscience, but it doesn't make things any better ever. And anyway, I that's the thing that stumps me about David. Every other piece about David, like being the strong warrior, I believe he had a tender heart. I think his heart was inclined toward God. The Bible says he had a heart after God. But I think whenever he was confronted, he repented. It wasn't, he didn't resist repentance. The struggles in his family stumped me, because all the people that he struggled with, he was related to.
I
Saul.
have some theories about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, now might be a good time to share them.
I mean, honestly, I feel that it's pretty typical for people who run countries or huge organizations, big businesses, when they are really successful, and that is what they are spending their time, their thoughts, all their talent on, that it often, more cases than not, happens that their family are going to be the ones who pay the price for it, and that they are not going to receive the time and attention and care that they need.
Yeah, I don't think I would disagree with that observation. In David's case, it seems to happen before he even gets in that position where Saul's concerned. But with his kids, I don't know how. Maybe y'all disagree that he should have killed Amnon, his son. I know that would have been tough. I get it. But he doesn't even address it.
Yeah.
He doesn't even say anything. Yeah. Like, that just stumps me.
That type of inaction right there can cause a great deal of people to question your leadership. I mean, as a father or a mother, they could easily relate to the fact that you're hesitant on that. But to not even bring forth any form of punishment, that just going to cause people to just completely question all of your leadership.
Yeah, he could have at least banished him, right?
Yeah, he could have done something. Put him in prison.
We never want to see
he
his
just
face
does
again.
nothing, doesn't even say anything. And that really begins the rift with he and Absalom, which in the end, it's heart-wrenching to watch, a father and son at odds with one another. The son, like I said, appears to have lost so much respect for him that there's nothing David can do that's going to salvage it. David, on the other hand, is willing to do whatever he can, to salvage it. And to the point of leaving, it's his chief officer that ends up killing Absalom, and David, is more upset about that. He gets scolded about it. It's just a real. I do think the beauty of the story of David for me is ability to see that God could take, and this is the passage that we're going to talk about today. God could choose to use David as his line, his lineage that Jesus was going to come from. And he could talk about him in such positive ways. You know, he was a man after God's own heart. You know, he killed Goliath. David killed his tens of thousands. He unified the kingdom. He had a heart to do some really significant things for God, but he also was significantly flawed. You know, he falls in love with Bathsheba, has her husband murdered, depends on the people, and has a census when God tells him not to. You know, he gets so mad that he's going to kill Nabal in this book, you know, and Abigail talks him out of it. So he is extremely flawed and extremely gifted, but we rarely talk about the flaws because he does such significant things for the kingdom. What kind of things can you overlook in leaders that you believe have the right heart but do the wrong thing from time to time? What kind of things can you overlook? What kind of things can you not overlook?
I think it's easy to overlook like things that somebody can say that's off the wall, or, you know, if somebody does something out of anger. Because I think, especially in this day and time, it's really hard for someone who's in a leadership position not to have something like that happen to them at some point, because everybody's listening and available all the time. But I mean, I think it's another thing for you to see somebody who's making like a bad moral decision.
Mhm.
You know, I think there's a difference between being human and having flaws, but having like moral deficiencies that, you know, give somebody the ability to make decisions that are going to affect an incredible amount of people. That is when I begin not to trust somebody.
Chris?
Yeah, the biggest thing is to know the person well, not to just assume that the person is just going off the rails or something like that. But yeah, just I mean the easy ones, if you know a person's heart or you just know their character, is that if they're acting out in a certain way that you can tell that they're going through a struggle versus them just going down a completely terrible path or something like that. But and there's obvious things that, we talked about in a previous podcast that are just like no-goes. There's just certain things that you just have to stop immediately. But I think the majority of it is just knowing the person well enough to know that they made a joke, but they didn't actually mean that or something like that.
Yeah, I think this is a really complicated thing in leadership. I do think morality has some bearing on it, significant bearing. But everything is not as black and white as we make it out to be.
Well, no, because a lot of times if you're not in that position, you don't know the whole story.
Right. But I'm going to give you some examples to things that I think, depending on your point of view, could cross the line or not cross the line, but that are a pathway to destruction. It's one thing, I have bad days. I'll bite somebody's head off. I'm fully capable of that. I'm fully capable of missing something I should have done, making an unwise choice. I'm fully capable of all those things. But I think there are some other things that I see in leadership that sometimes we tolerate because we believe the person has the right motives or the right heart. So let me see if I can give you an example. And I think it's easy to spot if it clearly crosses a line. So I think like adultery is a clear line that has been crossed. Like you that has to be dealt with. I think that's clear. Let's say I made inappropriate comments to you. Now, in our relationship, you would say you're stupid back off. That's different.
Yes, I would.
Right. So, but that doesn't always happen.
Right.
Every work leadership relationship's not made up that way. And you might keep your mouth shut for fear of losing your job, or how it would affect everybody else, or man, the church is doing really good. If we, if this got out, it would be terrible. So we tolerated. We covered up, and the person may defend overly flirtatious or forward or comments. They might say, well, it was innocent. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just joking, whatever. But when we turn a blind eye to it, it can lead down a path that is extremely dangerous, and said to the wrong person. And I could say that to you and we could laugh about it, because I believe if I crossed the line where you were concerned, and I try to be very careful about those things in particular, but if I did, like, you would just say, you're an idiot, or
call it out.
Yeah, you would say it to me, but every relationship's not that way.
Right.
And if they preyed on somebody who was much more vulnerable, it may lead to worse things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that at times we turn a blind eye to things that can lead to devastation that we should figure out how to address, because we're afraid of the bigger picture. What happens to the church? What if everybody finds out, or if this, if they what would other people think? And so we keep our mouth shut. I don't know if y'all have ever had an experience like that where.
Well, I think part of what you're saying is that their actions are indicative of something much larger.
They certainly can be,
but
yes.
People just ignore that.
Right. I mean, I've been in some situations where the church went to great lengths to cover up financial improprieties.
Mm-hmm.
Leaders did, it was never direct stealing. Like I went in, not me, but they went in and just actually took money, but they got it in lots of other ways.
Mm-hmm.
It was theft, frankly. And the church was doing well. If we derail this, what's going to happen? And so sometimes I think the danger becomes become so attached to certain success or a certain way of life or a certain thing that we want, that we overlook things that should be addressed.
I just thought of a really funny example.
Okay.
Well, I guess it's not so funny in the end. It was several years ago that you guys actually mentioned it, but there was, and I've been to the church, but there was a pastor of an absolutely enormous church. I have no idea what the numbers were at this point. Enormous. And you guys went to like a conference that he was part of, and you came back, and the oddest thing that had happened when y'all were there was that somebody came up onto the stage. It was like a personal assistant or something that practically gave him like hand sanitizer and opened his bottle of water and sat it on the table in front of everybody. And I remember when you said that, I thought that is dangerous because of how he viewed himself compared to everyone else, that he could actually justify needing someone to come do this for him, especially let everybody else see it, I mean, unfortunately,
he was actually sitting right across the table from us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, everything fell
unraveled.
pieces.
That's right.
I thought it was interesting that it hadn't been too long before that you guys saw that. And when you said it, my mind started to wonder.
Well, we all thought
what
the
else
same
is
thing,
going on?
or at least I did. That's certainly entitled. So, like, I can't, and I suspect that person was an intern. We have somebody who's being an intern in the room right now. I can't ever imagine saying, "Hey,
we don't expect her to come over here and hold the pot while we're drinking
come give me a sip of water
or whatever."
Can you wash our hands before? I do think there are signs that we have to pay attention to. That if we're not careful, leadership gets out of whack and things get out of balance, and before long, we have this terribly out of balance situation that can be dangerous.
And it's good to have people in your life that can keep you in check on that.
Mm-hmm.
I know one person for me is definitely my wife. I usually bounce things off her all the time. Sometimes she offers them up to me as well. Um, but just to make sure that I stay in check, and I just think that's a really good thing for all leaders to have.
Yeah, I think you should always have, like in a leadership position, at least 2 or 3 people who are willing to speak up. And
Mm-hmm.
now, I think in our case, we're probably weighted that way, meaning we have way more people that'll speak up in leadership and say, hey, that's a stupid idea, or you shouldn't do that. You can't act like that. I would say we're more weighted that way than a lot of places are, which has its own challenges. We're not the most fun group to be around always, but I hope it protects our integrity.
How everybody feels.
Well, I hope it protects our integrity.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's critical. So, anyway, let's transition. We're going to look at 2 Samuel chapter 7. I want to talk about some of the theological implications that we find here. All right, so let's talk about some of the theological applications or implications from this passage. So we have transitioned from Samuel, who was a judge, to David, who is the king. Well, it went to Saul first and then to David, obviously. And Samuel was the last of the judges, but he was also a prophet and a priest. And we're going to see some pieces, at least of the priestly side with David, that are still there. But God seems to be transitioning away from this role where one person was all three to separating them into different pieces. Why do you think God would be splitting these roles up? And is there anything that we can learn from that as church leaders today?
Well, when you have that many people that you're overseeing, having tons of hats to wear will cause things to either bottleneck or not work out well. Can also look at it as kind of like safeguards, where if you end up getting one person that ends up going corrupt, they're corrupt over 3 main areas. But also by splitting them into different roles can allow them to do each one of those jobs well, where they're just focusing on that particular area. And we're able to see before where they're all combined in one area, and then they get split out to other areas that when it comes back to Jesus, he's capable of doing all of them perfectly. So whatever you're able to pull out of that, but, I don't know where I was going. I just kind of lost where I was going with that. Sorry.
No, I agree that I think part of it is like a system of checks and balances. And I think that's important in any leadership, but you were talking about the church. I do think that that's especially important in the church, because you don't want to give one person so much power that they could make a decision that would devastate the church. But I do think it's important. I was actually just having a conversation with somebody about this the other day, about how the elders and the deacons work at our church and the staff, and how all of that plays together really well, and that it helps us make balanced decisions. That
hopefully,
I hope so too, because it goes through a lot of people, but we all, like you said earlier, are really honest with each other, and I think that it helps a lot.
Yeah, I think finding people's lane, even in the secular world, they spend a lot of time trying to do that. Jim Collins wrote a famous book called Good to Great, and I don't even know what his faith stance is at this point, but one of the things he talked about is, 1, you got to get the right people on the bus, and then 2, you got to get them in the right seat on the bus, because everybody don't operate the same way. And we go through regular work even to try to refine some of those things. So recently as a staff, we've gone through Pat Lencioni's book, The Working Genius. And all we're trying to do is even refine more our gifts, talents, and abilities, And I would say my observation of it is this: as long as a judge had limited power, going to a king, if he's going to have significantly more power. If you had added the spiritual element of both being a priest and a prophet to him being the ruler leader, like you centralize all that power in one, that is a dangerous person.
It's called a dictatorship.
Yeah, well, even with just being the king, removing prophet and priest, you see where bad kings led them in a bad direction, good kings led them in a good direction. Imagine how magnified that would have been if there hadn't have been prophets to push against them. If there hadn't have been priests to carry out, if it would all have been dependent on that person, man, it could have been a horrible, even worse than it was. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine some of the situations they found themselves in if it could have been worse, but it would have had to have been worse. In that situation. So at the beginning of this, it says, when King David was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all the surrounding enemies, the Lord summoned Nathan the prophet. Look, David said, I am living in a beautiful cedar palace, but the ark of God is out there in a tent. Nathan replied to the king, go ahead and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. But that same night, the Lord said to Nathan, and then he gives him a different instruction and says, David is not the one to build the tabernacle or the temple. They already have a tabernacle. Is Nathan wrong, or does God change his mind? I wish Zach was in here after this, after the last podcast that we just had. Is God change his mind here? Or is Nathan just wrong when he first gives these instructions?
I don't really, it doesn't tell us here, but it sounds like he immediately replied to him, God's with you, do what you see fit. So it sounds like Nathan did not have any type of prayer or confer with God at all before he made this decision and said, I think you should do what you feel like you should do.
Yeah, it seems like, Nathan, like anybody else, being like, well, yeah, why wouldn't you give God the best? Yeah, David, you are in this nice palace, and he's just out there in a tent. We should give him well beyond what we have. And I think that's oftentimes like a humanly response to things, even when we try to do good, for something or something that we think is good for the church or for the kingdom. But God might be saying, you know what, we don't need that right now. Simple's better.
Yeah, well, God tells him in this, the response to it, God tells him he's not going to be the one that builds it. There is a later passage that indicates that he doesn't get to build it because he kills Uriah. But that has not happened at this point. So God has already said, you're not going to do it. Later that gets written. Do you believe that God says you're not the one because I know what you're going to do? Or you're just not the one, I got other things for you to do?
It could really be, either of those, but also the people throughout, all the way back wandering in the desert up until now, God knew that these people were prone to shifting their temple to worship their main leader. One of the main reasons why Moses was buried by God, because he probably knew that they would have easily set up some sort of a statue or a place of worship or something. David's now leading them in great directions, and they can obviously see that God's hand is on him. Could also be kind of a protection thing for him and for the people.
Yeah, my observation about specifically Nathan here is that I think David is blessed. He's anointed. Pretty much everything he does, he's successful at. And I think Nathan's just acknowledging, hey, sure, if you do it, God's going to bless it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he thought he had to pray about it. I do think God comes back and with a different answer, and tells him something different. And then he goes into this covenant. God makes a covenant with David. So there are 5 covenants in Scripture. There's the Noahic Covenant, the Abrahamic Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, and the Davidic Covenant. And then you have the New Covenant after that. So this is the last of the covenants made in the Old Testament between God and people. What do covenants say about God, and what specifically does this covenant say about God?
Are you speaking to when he basically told him that the line of the Messiah was going to come from him?
And you're going to reign forever. That's your line's going to reign forever. That's essentially what he says. I'm going to give you something better than a temple, a legacy that you build a building. I'm going to leave a lineage that, as long as they're obedient, which didn't take long, his son screws that up pretty quick. But as long as they're obedient, the lineage will last forever. And of course, we do have the eternal lineage through Jesus Christ. But he makes a covenant that I'm going to do something for you that is greater than you can imagine. Typically, what do covenants say about God, and what specifically does this covenant say about God?
A promise, a relational promise to each other about things, what he's going to carry out. And like I've said before, I try to put myself in the shoes of the person and what they might be thinking. And with David being aligned with God right now and what he's doing, one of the biggest things that they could do back then was basically put up some sort of a monument or do something extravagant for God. And a lot of times it would be something that you could see that you completed.
That's right.
But God's basically telling him, I've got something better here for you, even though you're not going to physically see it right now. Don't focus on this.
Yeah, you talking about him, what he's focusing on. I feel like one of the things that the covenants tell us is that God understands what's most important in situations where we do not, because David thought the most important thing he was going to be able to do at that point was build a tabernacle. But what he didn't know until God made this covenant with him was that the Messiah that would be so long awaited was actually going to come from him.
Right. It through a convoluted line too, because I always have lots of questions when and I guess we can talk about that now. God is faithful to follow through with what he promised in spite of the things that we do. One of the unexplainable things in Scripture to me begins here in this story with David, in that David has multiple wives. He has Michal, who is Saul's daughter. He's going to later marry Abigail. There are like 6 or 8 that are named, and then there are places where it says he had multiple wives, at his disposal. God chose to use Bathsheba, the one that he got from murder and adultery, as the lineage that Jesus would come through. That was where he chose it to come through. When you read things like that, what does it say about God to you?
He's able to use anybody, but he's also able to bring something good out of something that maybe wasn't so, or that went wrong.
Right.
We actually talked about this on the last podcast.
The last time we recorded, yeah.
And I think that
we were looking at the book of Ruth.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I said was that God just knows us so well and how screwed up we all are, and that we're going to continue to do it. And I think that him using people that were obviously flawed it also gave us hope, because we understood that was what Jesus knew about us, and it was the same reason that we needed him in the first place.
Yeah.
And that God could see us clearly and still use us.
Yeah, I would say this concept of covenant is extremely critical because he is a covenant God, not a contract God. It's not, okay, you broke the contract, I'm in this null and
Right.
void, we're starting over. He was in covenant and he was faithful even when the people were not faithful. In this covenant, he speaks of Jesus. Do you think David knew what God was speaking of at that point? Do we have any indication that he understands the importance of what he's been told?
I mean, he gives a prayer of thanks. But I honestly think it would have been really difficult for him to have truly understood what God was talking about.
It seems like it to me.
Uh-huh.
I mean, gosh, we're post Jesus and struggle to understand at times, much less having no concept of that and it happening.
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, I don't really see any indication that he understood it to that level. And yeah, God, I mean, oftentimes either we see in Old Testament stories, like the promise to Abraham about Isaac and everything, that he says this is going to happen, but a lot of times we just have to be faithful in the process, even if we don't know what the end product is going to be. But yeah, I don't think that he knew exactly that this was going to be going to the Messiah.
Okay. Well, good. Let's transition over and talk about some of the practical applications that we can learn from this passage. All right. So, from a practical standpoint, verse 2 it talks about he clearly wants to do what's best. He wants to give God his best. Let me put it that way. But God responds a little bit differently. Have you ever done something for somebody maybe where you thought it was a good thing and they received it wrong? They rejected, what you were trying to do as kindness, maybe.
I am sure. I just can't come up with
Well, the thing that comes to mind
now.
for me is there have been a couple of instances where I've offered some assistance, financial assistance to people, and they were offended instead of like, well, sure. They just thought I was looking down on them or felt like, I thought something differently of them. That's the thing that comes to mind. I don't know. Chris, do you have?
There was one that sticks in my head, and we became good friends after it. But when my boys were little, the boy next door, he was riding around on a little bike. The boys were probably like 7. He was riding around on a little bike, and he would always be out there like ramping it, crashing it, and doing all kinds of stuff. And I had just got my oldest one a newer bike, not new, but newer bike, and the other one was just sitting there. And the little boy just said something about it, and I was like, "Well, if you want it, you can have it." Well, he took it back. He took it and rode it. He was all excited and everything, and then his dad sent him back with it and had him drop it back off, and essentially said, I was like, if he wants a bike, I can go buy him a bike. And I was just, I was like, that was not implied at all. It was just sitting there on the side of the garage, but it took a little bit. But he and I become pretty good friends after that. But yeah, that one kind of backfired in my face.
Yeah. Well, I think there are times where we think we're doing what is in somebody's best interest, but it's not. Or at least they don't perceive it to be in their best interest, and they take it wrongly. It can be they think we're better than they are, or you think you know it all. You're whatever. There's a lot of reasons why people can take it wrong, and sometimes people are just hurt, or they're in a different spot. And in spiritual matters, frankly, sometimes it's just the wrong thing to do. The timing's not right. Just don't need to. I mean, I can think you can do the wrong thing. You can do the right thing at the wrong time, and have almost as bad a result, not as bad a result, almost as bad a result as doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. You know, the right thing at the wrong time. Timing is matters, you know. And I don't think God was rejecting a temple. He says that. He's just rejecting David building the temple. How often do we speak for God without consulting with God? So Nathan says, sure, go do it, whatever you want to do. And then God speaks to him that night. How often do we speak for God without consulting God? And how can we keep that from happening?
I think this is a good example of how we can do that, because I think that in our minds, if whatever is up for discussion is in line with maybe the organization or, in a church, whatever that ministry is, then we assume, well, sure, that sounds like a good idea. Let's just move forward with it without asking God and without taking the time to fully understand the implications of it.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that just through either our upbringing, our studying, or what we've experienced in church that we would just assume would be a good thing to do. And we can easily just do a knee-jerk reaction and say, yeah, let's go ahead with that. Being diligent about being in prayer, being sensitive to what the Holy Spirit might be speaking into your life and leading you would be really good things to lean on to see if that is the right route, right suggestion, where to invest your time, your energy into. Those would be the things that I would encourage anyone to lean on. But I think that we're all guilty of just going with, yeah, this has got to be the right thing to do. It probably, like Sheryl was saying, just it aligns with everything else that we're doing right now.
Yeah, I can think of I think I can use this example. I'm pretty much to the point convinced that the next building project that here at the church that I want to participate in is some type of auditorium. And, that could have been an option 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, whenever we started the process eternity ago, but it could have been an option. And for many churches, it is the option. Like, that's the only thing they think is, okay, we're going to improve where the adults are first. But I think we knew that that wasn't the right path to take. It would have been the easiest path to take. I think it would have been the easiest paid for path to take, but it wasn't the right path to take. And in hindsight, I think we made the right choice. And I think a lot of churches do things like build an auditorium without thinking, or a gym. Those two, those both fall hand in hand. Mm-hmm. Like, we need a gym or we need an auditorium. Both of which are probably not true. You need to put some money somewhere else. Where's your greatest pain point right now? And how are you going to utilize it better? And even in hindsight, there were things we could have done differently that we didn't do. But I think we made the right choice. It wasn't a natural choice or the easiest choice. I just think it was the right choice. And I think, but nobody would have faulted us if we had built another auditorium. Mm-hmm. Nobody said, oh, that's a stupid idea. They probably would have said, hey, yeah, that's great. And I think a lot of times we do make choices that seem to be a natural, easy default, and we just do them. And without thinking, of course the Lord's going to bless it. I would even say things like get married. Is getting married a good thing? The Bible says it is. The Bible speaks highly of marriage. It's a good thing. But getting married for the sake of getting married because marriage is a good thing is a bad thing. You better make sure you've gotten the right one, or you're gonna.
Or it's not going to be a good thing.
Yeah, that's right. It's not going to be as good as you think it is. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that there are times where the Lord has spoken about marriage, even about things like, and so we'll talk about this a little further with the next question, but even about things like church building or evangelism, that there are pieces to it, or the timing is wrong. Does God want everybody to be saved? The answer is yes. But sometimes there's a seed that needs to be planted, and the seed needs to be watered before we start trying to harvest. And sometimes we're trying to harvest and there ain't even been a seed planted. We're out there trying to drag folks in, and they don't even know what we're talking about. And I just think that some things that are good get overemphasized, and we miss the timing of it and the order that God wants to put it in.
Yeah.
So David is concerned about a physical place for God to dwell. God says, I've never asked for that. But he also says somebody else is going to build it. So it wasn't not important to God. And I don't want to argue with God, but there's a piece of me that does want to push back a little bit. He did tell him to build a tabernacle. Like, he did create this exact measurement tabernacle that they carried everywhere for the ark to go in. So kind of, yeah, you did. That's what I want to say. Kind of, yeah, you did. But he's saying, I didn't ask for a permanent building, nothing fancy. I didn't need more than what I've already got. Should we be concerned about the physical dwellings for God today? And I would say both the church house and our physical bodies. Should we be concerned about both of those in the context of a place where God dwells?
Yes, because it becomes a representation of God to everyone else around, including ourselves and how we present ourselves to the world. I mean, I don't think you have to look like, a movie star every time you walk out of the door.
Right.
But, I mean, when you represent Christ, you do need to present yourself to the world in a way that people are going to, number one, respect you and think that you try to take care of yourself. But second, that people are going to be willing to listen to what you have to say.
Right.
And I think that's also true with the church. If it looks like it's fallen down and, we haven't put the time and effort and money into making the facility be as good as it should be, then it's pretty obvious that can also mean that there's some bad decisions being made, or things being ignored, or just not taken care of.
I tell people occasionally, I'll have a conversation with somebody like, you may not have resources to buy the newest clothes, or even to have new clothes, period. But it is nearly free to take care of what you've been given, and to take a shower, and to comb your hair. Like, it's nearly free. I don't want to say it's free. There's a little bit of expense, but it's nearly free, pennies. Yeah. And if you don't, the church, there are churches that don't have, we don't have resources other churches have. Like, I mean, I have church envy too. Just like everybody does. You see things and you go, man, I wish. I was in a church not long ago. They had a roller coaster in the kids department. Like, how awesome would that be? Like, to have a roller coaster in the kids department.
I'm still trying to figure out something in the budget. Just
for a roller coaster?
Well, maybe. At least a slide.
Yeah.
Ball pit.
But
that kind of thing.
But we can take care of what we've been given. And we can do the best we possibly can with what we've been given. I mean,
faithful.
Yeah, well, even right here. So this is the second year we've been recording in this room, and we have a little bit more room than we do. But like, y'all, if y'all should come look in this room. It's not like we're in some immaculate studio.
It's like a nice closet.
That's right. I know some people who walk in closets this big.
I do too.
It's not like we're in some fancy place, but we're making do with what we've got, And I think you just do the best you possibly can. Chris, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, whether we're talking about the church building itself or our bodies, there's no one cookie cutter way that all churches, all people should be. I think that each church building and each person gets a response differently from different people. There might be some people that I can relate to well compared to another Christian. Some people walk into facilities looking for something specific, and it'll speak to them. But there should be commonalities between them, specifically within us, that we are representing Christ, that we are walking authentically, not perfectly. And then when you walk into a church building, you can see that they are applying the appropriate resources that not only have a place that honors and respects God, but speaks something to the people around them. And I think there definitely needs to be a balance in where you're investing your resources, because everything is a resource, whether it's the building, the funds, or whatever, and trying to put it into the best place to further the kingdom for Christ.
Yeah, there's a difference between excellence and extravagance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and making sure you find that balance is important, because it's easy to go to extravagance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that, in my opinion, the temple is pretty extravagant, like gold plated everything.
Yeah.
You know, but in our conversation, you know, I think there are things we have to do with excellence. I could give you an example. So by the time this airs, we will be using an LED wall on stage. There are churches that have been using them for 10 plus years. 10 years ago, it would have cost more to put a LED wall in there than the whole wing of the church that we built. You know, if 10 years ago we had done it, it would have been extravagance. But the prices have come to a place now, okay, we can do something with excellence without, you know, being too extravagant. And I think you just have to learn to measure those things. And it's not always that easy. I think the same is true in our own personal lives. Like, you know, you can be extravagant, but you can present yourself well without being extravagant. You don't have to be, you know, you don't have to shop at Nordstrom's to look nice, you know. And I think that's important for everybody to understand. And it's not just how you dress, but I would say, at least for me, my greatest challenge is not certainly how I dress as much as it is how I take care of my physical body, you know, making sure I eat right, get enough exercise, sleep, you know, because those things matter too. If you can't physically do it, you're in trouble, you know. If I can't preach, you know, because I'm overweight, you know. You missed that fun. So last week's podcast, the one, and we would have just recorded it before this, we finished talking about Eli being old, fat, and overweight. And, you know, it is, you have to be conscious of that. You know, there are things that if I don't take care of my body, my physical body, I will not be able to do in the kingdom. They'll limit. You know, I laughed. So the Sunday before we're recording this, it'll be almost a month by the time you hear this. We would have been our fifth Sunday, and our kids would have been in the room. And this literally went through my mind, and I almost said it out loud at the end of the second service. I'm a squatter, so I don't mind getting down on my knees. You know, I've done it all my life. I used to sit, even until probably the last 5 or 6 years. I would get in the floor and sit on my heels and watch TV. But so all the kids come on stage, you know, and I got down on my knees. And when I was getting up, my knee popped, and I thought, how many more years am I going to be able to do this? You know, I'm going to need a chair or a stool, you know, because I'm getting old. But I can do things to take care of myself so that I can continually do that for at least a period of time. You know, I don't think the expectation is for me to do it in my 70s, but I certainly can do it for a while. And I have grandkids and may have more at some point that I want to be able to enjoy. And taking care of our physical body. Our physical body is the temple of the Holy Spirit at this point. This is the temple, and how we take care of it matters, you know. We don't have to be extravagant, but we do have to be excellent about it. Why do you suppose David was not chosen to build the temple? We're told later about Uriah. But why do you believe? Do you think it was just not God's plan, and that gets written later? I'm just curious.
Well, since God knows what's going to be coming up and the greatest probabilities and how they play out, um, it was definitely a good protection plan to make sure that David's hands weren't on that, considering what would take place in the future. And as I said before, it could, also be a protection for his heart for the people, that they don't raise him to a certain level that they shouldn't, because he already has all these other things going for him right now. It could easily look like, turn into where people begin to say that they're the Messiah, or they're the ones that are going to lead everybody into the right direction, well beyond what God has um, anointed him to do.
Yeah, and who knows what could have happened if it had have been built when, um, they split, and then his son basically tried to rule in his place and take over. I mean, his son may have destroyed it because
Right.
it seemed that he hated David.
Hmm.
And so who knows? I mean, I feel like God could have been aware of that. And I also agree that, I mean, David had, obviously, he's famous for so many different things already. And it seems that he knew that this particular job was going to be someone's life work,
Yeah.
and that it wasn't for him to be doing.
And, the speculation is later when he says you got blood on your hands, that he's speaking of Uriah.
Mhm.
But there is a group of people who read that to believe David was a man of war,
Mhm.
and he killed
So many
so many people, and it needed to be a man of peace to build the house, because Solomon was not a man of war. He was a man of peace. He had treaties, with pretty much
Mhm.
everybody. And maybe that was the case. I don't know. Maybe I do believe God has specific roles for all of us. And that's kind of how I want to close this out. I said earlier that I kind of, at this point, am settled on what I want to see the next phase be. And that means some of this space gets converted to something else. It's not going to be completely left out. Some things that I think people want. But I also know that there are thousands of other things that can be built after that and done after that, that I hope somebody does. But this is kind of the place. This will be the piece that God allows me to participate in. And we spend a fair amount of time trying to define our roles, and be good at it if we possibly can. Why is that important? Why is it important to find out what your role is and then excel at it, do it well, instead of trying to do what everybody else is doing?
I mean, I think it's important to do anything that you do with excellence, but especially when, are you speaking specifically toward like ministry?
Well, that's where we work, but I think in anything, I think even in marriage, there's no cookie cutter, like, you both do these things, and, there are gender related roles maybe, but I think that every couple is different. And sometimes we fall into stereotypical roles that are expected of us, instead of doing what we're good at. So I'll give some examples. For me, I'll just speak for me. There are things I'm not good at. I don't enjoy doing. In this book we've been through, they would be actual tensions, frustrations for me to do. And I have verbalized those for ages. Some of them, not all of them. Some of them I'm more and more aware of, but some of them I've verbalized for ages. But like hospital visitation or just visiting people, and pastoral care is a challenge for me. It just is. It's not that I don't care. It's just that I'm more gifted at creating avenues for them to be taken care of than I am caring for them themselves. However, if somebody calls and asks for something, I'm going to try to do it. So yesterday I got a call to tell me about someone else whose mother had passed away. So I made it a point that I was going to check on that person. But that's not my natural inclination to do. And I know that, so if I'm asked to do something, if there's something here at the church, like that needs to be done, I don't naturally think, okay, you should do that. I can walk by a sink full of dishes at my house for days and never think you should wash these, it's just that's not how I think. But if I decided, okay, if I'm going to abandon some of the things I do well to do some things I don't do well, mm-hmm. I think the organization would suffer. The church would suffer. And I think sometimes we're afraid, and I'll tell you on the other side of that. I did a funeral last year, and I said in the funeral, I hate visiting the hospital. I said it, but the person I was doing the funeral for loved it. Like that was their gift. And I was just pointing out, how God gifts different people different ways. There was another pastor who was doing the funeral with me. And after it was over with, he said, I hate doing the hospital too. He said, but I'm scared to death to tell people that I hate it. He said, because I'm afraid they're going to judge me. Maybe, maybe not. I think sometimes we get pressured into things that we're not good at. I don't come in your area and tell you what you should do because it just ain't my thing. Like this lady told me Sunday after the children's lesson, she said, this is the second time I've watched you do that. She said, these children are just mesmerized with you. I said, those kids hate me.
They hide.
Yeah, when they see me coming, they're ducking, but I don't come in your area to try to tell you what to do because I am smart enough to know that's not my gig, but just in life in general, why is it important for people to find what they're good at, excel at it, and then not be afraid to pass off some other things?
You go ahead.
I think one of the biggest things is respect. I mean, if somebody respects you, even if they don't necessarily agree with you or they don't quite see things your way, they're willing to listen. And even in times of uncertainty, they're probably going to either grow from it or watch what it is you're doing. And I learned a lot of that when I worked in the factory as a machinist. Everybody had their own way of doing things and stuff, but a lot of times I would end up be put in charge of training people because I tried to work well with people and listen to them and teach them what I knew. And I think that when you do your job well, people will respect you, and then also in the way that you treat them. We'll just leave them open to listening to what it is you have to say, and then you can roll that into Christian application where if you're doing your job well, and people respect that in you, there's different areas that you can go and you can minister to them that you might not be able to if they looked at you and they just saw that you weren't doing your job very well or carrying yourself with excellence.
I also think that God, you spoke to that. He specifically made each of us different to carry out different jobs. And, I know from experience that when you have other responsibilities or you've chosen to make other things more important in your life, things get out of balance. And I think that, you've been in the position before of knowing someone who loves what they do, and you can see it all over everything they do. They do it well. People get excited to be part of what they're doing because they do it so well. And I think that God has given us specific areas in life that each of us are gifted at doing that way, which makes us part of one huge body that God has created as a body of Christ. And if we're not fulfilling what we're supposed to be doing, then we're taking somebody else's job. Yeah. And we're keeping them from doing what they're supposed to be doing. But you're also not going to get the same fulfillment and reward that you're going to get out of being able to do something that you love.
Yeah, and there's so many numerous resources that you can use to find, to narrow that down. In premarital counseling, like one of the questions I always ask is, in your home, who in the home you were raised in, who handles the money. Because they come in thinking, okay, that's my role. My mama did it or my daddy did it, so I have to do it. Well, if you suck at money, you don't need to be doing it. Like if you can't add, subtract, know how to do a budget, but your spouse can, I don't really care who did it at your house you grew up in. The other person needs to do it. But we're like, well, my dad did it. Men are supposed to do it. I got to do it. No, you don't. Like my wife does most of the yard work. We pay for somebody to cut the grass. I do not feel one bit of shame when she's out working in the yard and I'm not. I don't go, oh man, that's a man's job. I don't enjoy it. I hate every second of it, Now, if she asks me to help, I'll help. But I think we stereotypical put people in roles and think they've got to. My wife was in that position when I wanted to go back in ministry. She's like, I don't want to be a pastor's wife. I can't be a pastor's wife, because she had seen like 2 pastors' wives in her life, and they were a specific kind of person, large and in charge. They ran whatever they wanted to run. She's like, I can't be that person, and she figured out she didn't have to be. And I think if we're not careful, we won't do what we're good at, and we'll frustrate ourselves doing things we're not good at, and everybody will suffer because of it. Those children are better off that they only hear from me 4 times a year, right? But if I sacrifice that, the children would suffer and the adults would suffer too. So I think it just matters. So. Well, let's wind this up. Next week, we'll be talking about 1 Kings. I hope that you'll join us. Make sure you like and subscribe, whatever channel or platform that you're watching or listening on, so that you can be a part of this each and every week. We'll see you again then.